their naturally occurring testosterone. And POS is frequently found among high-level female athletes. Now, this doesn't apply to all sports. It mostly applies to some kinds of middle distance running, which is exactly the type of running that Castor was doing. Some people were speculating that these rules seemed almost custom-made to restrict Castor individually, something that she herself took them to court over. Now, Sport Court argued that yes, it is discriminatory. So what? Well, actually, the argument goes that it is discriminatory, but it has to be a little bit discriminatory in order to ensure fair play. Arguably, fair play for everyone except for Castor. And here is where we reach a point of over-taxonomy, especially in women's sports. Let's say, for the sake of debate, that Castor's performance advantages are actually advantages. We don't know this. It could just be that she's a very good athlete. But let's say that they are advantages. Why should she not be allowed to compete against other women? By almost every single culturally understood reason except for chromosomes, which no one can check anyway, she is a woman. She should be allowed to compete with women. And this is something that we can only distinguish thanks to modern technology. And this brings me to another type of advantage that many people have mentioned in relation to Castor. Michael Phelps. Michael P. here has a genetic advantage. He has an abnormally large wingspan. This advantage has allowed Michael to advance in his sport more so than basically any other contestant who does not have his genetic anomaly, which a lot of people have seen as amazing luck. How lucky he is to have something that could actually help him in sport, something that sets him apart, sets him above everyone else. But that's not fair. Using the arguments from Sport Court and other types of sporting organizations, you could say that you might need to discriminate against that type of anomaly to ensure fair play for every other swimmer. But no one is arguing that. Similarly, there are many genetic advantages that impact sport, many of whom cis women have and are freely available to use in their sport. Again, that's not fair according to the level playing field, but they're still allowed to do it. The only time it's seen as an unwanted advantage is when it can be even tangentially related to sex. And this goes back to us forcing a division between men and women. But obviously dividing advantages and disadvantages too far doesn't work either. Eventually you end up with some sort of sports eugenics where everyone who is allowed to compete is functionally genetically identical. At that point, sports doesn't matter anymore. That means that we all sort of know we can't pull too far in that string. If we pull too far in it's not fair, eventually the entire concept of sport is just going to fall apart. But obviously there should be some dividing line. But that means fairness is a choice of what we choose to accept. And it looks like the people who we don't accept within the concept of a fair competition are people who are intersex and people who are trans. And with all of that in mind, it becomes almost impossible to actually find a biological distinctive feature that only applies to all trans women and no cis women. And because of that impossibility, there is only one choice left for most people who are actually doing the most of the talking in this conversation. Outright banning trans people specifically. Part 3. The transes. Probably the most significant problem about having this discussion is that while we're having a pretty nuanced take about biology, sports, and testosterone levels, there is a simultaneous conversation that is not about sports, actually. A discussion about blatant bigotry. This discussion does have a lot of nuance, and I do think that we need to respect that. But that nuance has been co-opted by many people of anti-trans persuasion. Researching this topic was a nightmare because basically half of all sources do not acknowledge the nuance. Some will be well-meaning, basically wanting to reject the conversation entirely, saying that there is no difference between trans women and cis women, and therefore the discussion is null and void. But I think that cedes way too much ground to people who are anti-trans, who will market themselves to fairly ignorant people in the middle of the discussion who might not know a trans person and almost definitely do not know a trans athlete. And then on the other hand, there are multiple sources that are blatantly written by full-on transphobes, whose entire argument will basically boil down to trans women should not be included in sports because that means that your young daughter will be exposed to sweaty, hairy dick and balls. Do you want that to happen? Because that's what the transgender left will want. I think it bears mentioning that in the eyes of a lot of people, the transgender tipping point has tipped too far. Trans people are everywhere now, and trying to account for trans people in a society that never considered us in the first place is making people uncomfortable. A lot of people don't want to change any rules, any structure. They don't want to change for what they view as a very, very small minority. Because of this, a lot of anti-trans people have tried to restrict the presence and visibility of trans people in public life. This has taken a couple of different forms. In some places, for example, now, it's kind of controversial to even mention LGBT subjects in schools for fear that parents and the state will take you away. In Texas, they've recently announced that trans kids are apparently victims of abuse by virtue of being trans and can be taken away from their families if they receive any type of trans medical health care. But what you might most have heard of is bathroom bills. In the last couple of years, a lot of people tried to restrict women's spaces to only biological women, something that some people in Europe also want to emulate. The flaws in this have been pointed out many times, and eventually most people kind of felt that why should we need to restrict this? Because trans women have been going to women's restrooms all the time for years and there hasn't really been much of an issue. And I think most people kind of understood that. But then people realized we haven't seen that many trans athletes, have we? And because trans women are biologically different from cis women and because sport is so biologically determined, this resonates with many people. This is the real reason why this topic is blowing up currently. It's not really about concerns about women's sports, and I'll get to why I think that later. But suffice it to say that trans women have been taking part in sports for a long time, haven't been dominating in many areas, and has only recently come under fire for potentially, maybe, breaking records everywhere, even though that's not actually happening. Another consequence of this, though, is that this causes unforeseen consequences. Because trans women in sports are under such high scrutiny now, even when everything is accounted for, and even when the rules and the playing field is completely equal, it's basically an unstated rule that trans women are not allowed to win. We may be able to compete, but in the law of large numbers, and with thousands of competitions taking place every year, odds are eventually a trans woman is going to win sometimes. That's just statistics. But thanks to the hullabaloo about this, every single individual case would be massively overblown in the media, leading to accusations of unfairness. And I think we have some evidence of this happening, even when it's not actually trans women involved in it. In 2019, Liao Mengrui and Tong Shengwan were awarded first and second place in a Chinese running competition. Because of this, they made some news and some pictures were taken, and immediately the gender-critical part of the internet began accusing them of actually being men. The idea that they don't look enough like women, and that the only reason that they could possibly have won that race is because they're actually men in disguise. After images and clips from the race hit the Chinese internet, a number of net users cried foul, charging that the pair were actually men masquerading as women. What do you think? We think that the 2020 Olympics are going to be a complete travesty of unfairness to women. Sad. Of course they're men. Time to boycott the games. Of course they're men, but they're not bothering with the masquerade. We just have to take their word that they are wrong men. They lie. I think men are never women, and China, along with the rest of the handmaiding world, can fuck off. I assumed it was a men's race. This is not on. Yeah, I'm sure you were watching this Chinese running competition intently. Looking at the hips, greater trochanter positioning and belly button, Adonis belt, etc. I reckon out of the 4, only 1 is born a female. But hey, that's where the world is going. Goodbye, women's sports. They're not, by the way. They are cis women. They're not intersex. They don't have some condition that gives them excess testosterone. They are not trans women in disguise. They are just cis women. And this type of outrage did not spring from a concern over women's sports or concern of sex testing among athletes. It came because people wanted to be transphobic. But a consequence of this hyper scrutiny means that cases like this will be overly publicized. How many people in the West do you think are actually that interested in international running competitions in China every year? Probably a few of you. But they rarely make international news in this way. People win competitions all the time. But unfortunately, Googling the names of these competitors no longer brings up their statistics or athletic competence, but rather the scandal about them potentially being men, which a lot of people to this day are adamant about. Now, a lot of people who are gender critical are aware of this. They don't actually care about the truth. But cases like this is something that they can market to an uninformed mass of people, and they can convince them of saying, hey, look, the transes are going too far. They're cheating once again, but you can stop it. So this works as a wonderful way to lure people in with a crumb of nuanced discussion, and then packaging that kind of nuanced discussion in a wrapper of complete bigotry. Now, I don't love the argument of saying that restrictions against trans women are bad because they hurt cis women. It should be bad enough that they do hurt trans women, but it goes to show that the argument of fairness doesn't actually extend to women generally, but rather women who conform to the norm. And it completely undercuts the argument that this is about the sanctity of women's sports. Because if they actually believed that, there would be other solutions here. Solutions that did not exclude more cis women than it does trans women. Because that's what a lot of these measures do. Because remember, there aren't a lot of trans women out there, and especially not a lot of trans athletes. In women's sports, the overwhelming vast majority are cis women. And basically any restriction that you put on trans women in order to conform will eventually also affect multitudes of cis women as well. Unless you put a blanket ban on trans people competing in sports generally, which is actually the goal of what a lot of people want to do. But let's deal with the argument of protecting women's sports. Is that actually what's happening here? A lot of people who wade into this debate seem to focus on trans women as maybe the greatest danger to women's sports to ever exist. But that's not really the case. Take, for example, the social issues that I mentioned earlier. Women's sports, and more often girls' sports, are vastly underfunded when it compares to men's sports. In many areas of the world, when sports are invested in, overwhelmingly it's invested in boys' sports. And oftentimes academic programs tailored in sport are often marketed to men. Even high-ranking female athletes are not being given as much in compensation than male athletes, which diminishes their return when they want to invest in sports science custom tailored to a specific athlete. These things cause a significant amount of underperformance in women's sports generally. You can argue that this is not fair, but these things are never mentioned, at least by the people claiming to have major concerns about trans women in sports. Again, sporting organizations seem to actually know more about these issues than culture warriors on the internet. Let's talk about the trans man, Mac Briggs. Mac ends up being on Twitter quite a lot from misinformed people who think that he's a trans woman. I personally know many transgenders, people that I respect. But that doesn't take away that the transgender girls/women are stronger and faster than biological girls/women, and that's not fair to them. Their rights are being trampled, and some of them will get hurt too. Mac is a competitive wrestler who has, for most of his wrestling career, been forced to compete against women. This is because the state demands that he compete based on the gender on his birth certificate, which means that he, as a trans man, is forced to compete against women, even though he wants to wrestle in the male league. However, transphobes on the internet constantly assume that he's a trans woman because he keeps winning titles, and a lot of articles just say transgender wrestler. And his case is also an example of the rule set basically misfiring because he is within the biological limits set out by the wrestling committee. Does he have an unfair advantage? Maybe, maybe not. He falls within the biological limits of what he should be according to the rules. This is society and sport as many people want it to be.
Hey, old man, give me everything.
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! But not for me.
And still, people will accuse it of being unfair because the transes are winning, showing once again that trans people are basically not allowed to win at all. But what solutions do I offer, you might scream into the ether? I don't really have that much to offer. A lot of sports, however, do have alternatives to gender-segregated sports, such as weight classes. Now, having weight class as a segregated category works in sports where weight is important, but a lot of other sports have different metrics for what could grant an advantage. So one argument that some people have been proposing is to segregate trans people into a category of ourselves, which I'm not actually opposed to in principle, as long as it doesn't exclude trans people from the rest of society. At that point, we're just putting them all in the corner and pretending to ignore the problem. But rather, we should segregate sports into more different categories. For example, Michael Phelps, with his fucking albatross arms, maybe should be forced to compete with other albatross birds instead of regular humans. That way, regular humans have a shot at fairness too. This is actually how many events happen in the Paralympics, because different conditions cause different ability. So athletes are sorted by that ability, since that has a much bigger impact than any sex difference. A similar argument was actually proposed by sports philosopher Jane English in 1978, where athletes could move up to a higher tier of competition. This would, effectively, circumvent the entire discussion around sex and gender, as well as remove any need to force athletes to conform to sex stereotypes in order to compete, like with Caster. If someone does have an abnormal advantage, they can simply move up a level. And a system like this is already in place when it comes to boxing, and every sport could adapt this system to fit within their own sport. Either one of these options would work fine, with some even arguing that women's sports might not even need to exist if these alternatives were implemented. I personally disagree on that point, but there's no rule against diversifying a sport like this. But where do we go from here? Honestly, more studies are needed. I sound like the end of an academic paper, but that's sort of the situation that we're in. But I want you to remember that there is nuance here. And just remember that sports is a fake category. If someone wants you to agree to exclude trans women from sports as a nebulous concept, odds are that they are doing a poor argument or that they are lying. And I do want to end this video by saying that in my research, most, with some exceptions, of the sporting organizations that I've talked to have been sympathetic to trans athletes as a group. Many of them do want to find a way to enable fair play, to enable fairness in their respective sports. And from what I've seen, many of them are trying to do as fair of a job as possible. But I want to say that this discussion isn't coming from those organizations. It is coming from anti-trans activists who are highlighting a very small minority of sporting organizations and athletes who are themselves oftentimes anti-trans. And we can see this quite easily with the fact that many organizations haven't changed their rules or changed their practices, and there hasn't been a massive influx of athletes in recent years. The only thing that's happened is that anti-trans activists have lost the bathroom issue, and they're moving on to something else. Especially since many of these rules are coming from politics, not from sports science organizations, who have a much more vested interest in real fairness. And I think a final sign of this is that this discussion is almost exclusively happening in America from Republican districts and from the UK. In the end, this is not a discussion about fairness or biology. It is a question of politics. But you know what sport isn't super anti-trans? Hello. Tonight I will tell you 3 stories about 3 women. I will tell them in chronological order so that they make sense, but I will tell them because they tell together a larger story, one cohesive narrative.
I think that's a pawn, no?
And that narrative is about the left,
So I take
and it's
check.
about trans women. It is a story of activism,
I just take
anger,
the bishop.
and of course, counterpoints. Well, I have to mention her this early so that the people who are here just for the drama posting have something to latch onto, but we'll get to her. Nearly 3 years ago, I made a video called "The Left Doesn't Care About Trans Women." As a card-carrying member of the left, and being a trans woman, you can imagine that I had a lot to say. Around the time, there was, as it always is, discourse. However, these stories are a bit older. They're not really current, which is just great for the algorithm. Good job, Mia. Your choice of video topics is always so choice. Instead, we're going to talk about identity politics. And this is one of those subjects that keeps coming up, and it never really goes away. Now, obviously, I can't talk about every single thing that identity politics would encompass. However, this is already sounding a bit academic, so let's boil it down a little bit. I think the real question is, how do we talk about issues? And why do we talk about them the way that we do? I do, however, think that these stories serve to example a sort of microcosm of a much larger phenomenon.
Alright,
And
we'll
it's
do
a
this.
phenomenon that is very impactful
knight
to
takes
the way
d5,
that
of
we
course.
think about very, very fundamental things. Chelsea Manning. So let's begin the storytelling.
So I wonder,
A long time
c5,
ago, in a discourse far,
like
far
be forced to go
away.
knight c.
Okay, but for real though. Chelsea Manning is a whistleblower who became very famous in 2010 for leaking classified documents about the US military's activities in Iraq and Afghanistan, and specifically about a lot of bad things that the US military did there. Now, leaking that information is undoubtedly heroic, especially, in the eyes of people who are, against war crimes, which should be you, and if it's not, leave for this. She was jailed from 2010 until 2017, when her sentence was commuted by outgoing President Barack Obama, and then she was free. After this, she became a primary challenger against Ben Cardin. Basically, she was going to try to become a senator, becoming pretty big in mainstream politics, and people fucking loved it. And a lot of people thought that she never should have been jailed in the first place. And it's important to note how loved she was in online lefty spaces at the time. I myself had a bunch of stickers around my dorm room in university about free Chelsea Manning, and even more so in online trans spaces, because Chelsea is a trans woman. At the times Chelsea could communicate to the outside world, people were ecstatic. She was always cheered on by thousands of other leftists who would cheer along with similarly emoji-laden tweets. But then, in January of 2018, Chelsea attended a far-right gathering, for lack of a better term. And what? Is this a twist? Chelsea out of jail and suddenly she's a Nazi? Well, no. But for a few days on Twitter, it wouldn't be hard to assume that Chelsea had somehow cosplays as the Führer or something. I remember tons of people saying that Chelsea's actually a lib. She doesn't actually care about revolutionary politics. She just wants to hang out with other elites of lefty politics. Oh, how times have changed in the discourse, huh? A thought on Chelsea Manning at alt-right party. all famous people have more in common with each other than any one of us have with any one of them. We are worlds apart. She's trying to split the Democratic vote. She's an alt-right plant. Her intent was to infiltrate this space in order to sort of see how these people operate in a space where they think they are surrounded by like-minded individuals. How does the far right think when they think they're alone? There were a lot of people who, in good faith, also had criticisms of her actions. And I would also say that, you know, maybe things could have been done better. But like, people disagree all the time. To disagree is normal, but there's a difference between disappointment or critique or dislike and a feeling of utmost betrayal. And that is what a lot of people felt against Chelsea at the time. All of these things would have been wild to say if anyone just took a step back and realized what her claim to fame even was. And you know, if it happened today, I have no doubt it would have been worked into conversations about cancel culture that everyone was having until, you know, the pandemic canceled all culture. But I think that there is more here than actually meets the eye. Now, we need to start talking with these stories with a little bit of background. Identity politics is one of those words that you keep hearing on the internet, but that is almost never defined as anything real. Like, it is an established academic term, and we'll get to that. I should say, however, that I don't think identity politics are necessarily a good or bad thing. They're a tool, and they're a very useful tool, but that tool can be used for both good and for bad. But 9 out of 10 times that you hear it on the internet, it's usually by some edgelord who's talking about how much he hates trans people, or gay people, or anyone who has like a prefix of some sort. If you are something people, that person probably hates you. How dare you have an identity? Identity politics isn't necessarily something that people actively do, but rather it is a phenomenon that is sort of ascribed to people. Sometimes it's just doing politics with people who have a similar or identical identity to you, and specifically having specific causes that are relevant for those specific identities. The base idea of identity politics is that there are some people who, by virtue of their identity, are more subject to oppression than other people in society. And it follows that we can organize along those social lines, along lines of shared oppression, in order to sort of gain emancipation, to gain progressivism, to become a more progressive society, working from the bottom up, so to say. For example, a society can be homophobic, and so people who are gay can organize with other gay people for gay causes. And some people talk about this as sort of a way to create hyper-specific classes based on sexuality, race, gender identity, and religion, and so on. Oh, but hang on there. Classes? My father has told me that there are only 2 classes, and variations of those 2. It is the proletariat, the bourgeoisie. Because of this crime against politics, I will now organize against the identities. And stop me now, SJWs. The only true cause is a cause of revolution and communism. Okay, I'm kidding. I'm exaggerating like a little bit. But I should say that when I made my last video about this, talking about the story that happened with Chelsea Manning, and talking about how the left can sometimes be a bit class focused, I had a lot of people contact me saying that you should be grateful. The only rights you have is because of the left. And that's it. It is only because of the left. And that's it. I cannot change this. I think this is an example of where some people have the opinion that identity politics distract from actual progressive causes. The historian Arthur Schlesinger talks about identity politics sort of fracturing politics. Schlesinger argues that viewing politics in this way is what is causing fractions in society, which I think is a very bad take. Schlesinger has some very weird ideas around identity politics, which might explain his opposition to it. He believes that movements for civil rights should aim towards full acceptance and integration of marginalized groups into the mainstream culture, rather than perpetuating that marginalization through affirmations of difference. He's basically saying that by
Check.
acknowledging that people are different, people cause their own
Check.
division, which is wild. I'm gonna need more wine for that one. But there are criticisms of identity politics that are far less yikes. One criticism that is common both in the left and the